Good afternoon, Senator. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you, Heather?
I'm good, good. It's the end of a long week, I think, in September. I want to ask you right off the top about reopening at the Senate. How's that going? What are the issues around it?
So it's an ongoing conversation, and the members of the House and the Senate really are trying to find ways to, first of all, bring legislators back into the building so that we can meet together in our legislative chambers, but also to try to find a way where we can reopen the State House to the public, because it's been closed essentially since the onset of the state of emergency. And I have to tell you, Heather, it's very strange to walk around this building and not see any members of the public, and to hardly see anyone for that matter. But in order to accomplish those objectives, we need to make sure that the building is safe and that we are not fertile ground for the transmission of COVID-19 and any of its variants. And so the discussions that we're having are largely focused on vaccinations and people being required to get vaccinations. The Senate, in fact, has adopted that policy that members and staff are required to get vaccinations, and certainly there are exceptions if you have a medical condition that warrants an exception or a sincerely held religious belief. And even beyond that, our Human Resources Department is working on an individual basis with folks that can't meet the requirement. The House is having a similar kind of conversation, and it's very difficult. And so the House is trying to find its own way toward requiring vaccinations and making sure that everyone who's in the building near each other is, to the greatest extent possible, number one, either vaccinated, or number two, isolated or wearing a mask, or not transmitting or certainly contracting COVID-19. And I have to tell you, Heather, it's a very difficult discussion. And so the members are all trying to work through this. We won't be able to move forward, I don't believe, until the House and the Senate have reached some level of agreement on what the rules should be. In the Senate, we're working on it. The House is trying to develop a policy, but I think it's important for folks to know we are trying to find a way to get back to a place at the State House where people can come and visit, and where we can meet in the legislative chamber in person to the greatest extent possible.
So just to be clear, the Senate President Spilka has mandated vaccines in the Senate?
Yes.
Okay.
So what happened, there was actually a committee, and the committee has been meeting periodically to talk about all manner of things. I serve on it, and the committee has looked at how do we bring staff back to work rather than having them be remote? Maybe we have a hybrid model. That's what we're thinking about right now, where some folks come back, some folks do not, and maybe then they rotate. And as part of those discussions, the committee took up the issue of vaccination and made some recommendations to the president and to the Human Resources Department. And based on those recommendations, we have the policy that I described, where folks are required to be vaccinated unless they meet eligibility for an exception, or they find some special accommodation with the Human Resources Department. The House has not progressed that far yet, but that's something that's very much under discussion, and you'll find an editorial in today's Gloucester Daily Times about that.
I will go right to that. Is it possible for you to shed a little bit of light on why the House is having a harder time?
Well, I don't think there's the degree of consensus that there was in the Senate relative to the requirement of a vaccine. I think there are some folks that do not believe it should be required, and some folks who have made their opinions known in a very vocal way about that. And I would suggest that's really the difference, and they're still trying to work through the best way to respond to the needs of the members. And I spoke with Speaker Mariano earlier in the week on Monday, and I know that he is very concerned about this and is very committed to try to find a path forward. And our own representative, Representative Ann Margaret Ferranti, has had a role in that and has had a voice in that. And it's particularly important to her because of the health challenges that she's dealing with. And she feels very strongly, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I think it's fair to say she feels strongly about making sure that the State House is a safe environment. So the House is working through something that the Senate committee and then the Senate leadership has worked through, maybe not even to full conclusion, but at least enough now so there's a policy in place. That isn't the case yet in the House.
And you feel as if it's just not this, it's just too ineffective, you personally, I'm asking, to continue with a hybrid form of government?
Well, it certainly has been working for us, but I think we all agree that it would be much better if we were in person. Whatever circumstances we have to face, we will face them. And if that means working in a hybrid fashion, we'll continue to do it. But there generally is a desire for us to be able to come back, and I share in this view, to be able to come back and work together in this building. And there's been a lot of expression of interest in that and a lot of support for that. But at the same time, that eagerness to be able to come back into the building is tempered by an understanding that we have a responsibility to keep each other safe.
Well, let's talk about one of my favorite subjects, redistricting, because I just think it's fascinating how the whole process works. The census has been completed, and I understand you are at work at redistricting. Do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely. And I think this is something that's really important for people to understand. And I'm really glad you raised it because redistricting is a critically important function of state government because it determines the districts by which our equality as voters are guaranteed. And so we actually had started the process a while ago. We have redistricting committees in place. There's a Senate committee, for instance, that will draw Senate districts, and there's a joint committee that will work on things like congressional districts and governor's council districts. And we've been at work on that for a while, but the difficulty is the census data that comes from the federal government was delayed for a whole variety of reasons, primarily COVID-19. And so we've been trying to set up the frameworks to use that data even in advance of getting it. Well, now we have it. And we have information that's very interesting in terms of the state and having population growth. It also points to the fact that in Western Massachusetts, we haven't had that kind of population growth, so we have to adjust for that. And again, the ultimate goal here is to make sure that everyone's vote counts equally. And to do that, we have to have districts that are drawn sufficiently to provide that. They have to be close in population, but there are also other considerations that are required by the Voting Rights Act to ensure that minority populations, for instance, have a fair chance in the process to be able to have representation that reflects the composition of the district. And so there's a lot of work being done about that. And again, we now have the federal data. And I will tell you, Heather, it's a huge difference from some of the efforts that I've been involved with in the past. So in the old days, in times past, when we used to do redistricting, this would all be a paper exercise. And it was really difficult and time consuming to draw maps on paper based on data that you had and information that you had. The last couple of efforts, and I've been involved with those, and I'm certainly involved with this one, we have computer technology, which is light years away from the way that it used to be done. And so you and I can sit at a computer right now and draw legislative districts, and we can change something in a moment that used to take us a very long time to change in the past. So computer technology has fundamentally changed the way that we do this. And in fact, there are programs now where the folks that are watching us can experiment with this themselves and draw districts. One is known as Dave's redistricting, interestingly enough, and that's one that legislators use quite often. And the other one is called Districtor, district with an R at the end. And folks can do, again, what used to take at first legions of people working on paper and then massive computers. And now they can do it with just a PC or a Mac and do it from their home. So that's changed a lot, but what has not changed is the complexity and sensitivity of getting the districts right. And there is a time component to this because for state house districts, those need to be drawn before 1 year out from the election. And the reason for that is because House members are required to live in their district a year before the election. And so in order for everyone to have a fair chance in the process, we have to have those districts drawn and into law so people know what they are so that they can comply with the residency requirement. The Senate doesn't have that requirement. So we have a little bit more flexibility, and we have a little bit more flexibility with the congressional maps. But as a general proposition, it's the House timeline that drives the process. And we hope to get all of them done in sufficient time that people know what they are and can understand them before the next election.
So we were talking before this conversation about how sensitive it can be for both constituents and probably, senators and representatives when their districts change, when someone a constituent is comfortable and used to, dealing with their representation and it changes. You want to talk about that?
Well, sure. So folks certainly over the course of a decade, because we do redistricting every 10 years, can get very accustomed to being part of a community of interest that's represented by that district. And so when you start changing that, it's disruptive to the extent where they have to think about being part of a new community of interest, a different community of interest. And you have to think carefully about how the communities in that district relate to the other communities after you spent 10 years getting used to the configuration that you had. It's not something that's insurmountable, but it's something that can certainly be difficult, particularly if you have communities that share things like regional schools. And suddenly the regional district is represented by different legislative districts or more than one legislative district. So there are a lot of things to think about. And again, the most important priorities are to make sure that everyone's vote counts equally and that the system is fair and has integrity. But beneath that, there are a lot of things that play a role, and it can certainly cause significant concern and significant disruption when districts change.
So what is the timeline for this?
So again, the goal is to, by roughly the end of October, the beginning of November, to have at least the state legislative maps in place. The congressional map may come a little bit later than that, and the governor's council district may be a little bit later, but the goal is generally to follow the House timeline, which is to get them done at least a year before the election that will come next, the regular state election. And here's an interesting point. So we know, because of the resignation of Representative Hill to join the State Gaming Commission, that there's going to be a special election for that district. And that is going to happen sometime in November. And people will rightfully ask, well, will the new district be in effect for that? And the answer is no. These districts are being drawn for the next set of regular elections. So any set of special elections that happen before that will not be affected by the new legislative districts. And so, for instance, in the Senate, we have Senator Boncory, who left his position in the Senate to go to work for Mass Bio, and his election for his vacant seat will not be governed either by these new districts. They are for the next set of regular elections.
Which is 2022, right?
Correct.
Right. So I have one more question before we lose you on a Friday evening. There was a lot of conversation in the City of Gloucester preliminary election debates about the wastewater treatment center there. Can you clarify what the issues are around the wastewater treatment center? And is there an imminent issue with needing to replace it?
Well, the imminence and the urgency we could debate a little bit, but it's clear that at some point that plan is going to be need to be upgraded or replaced. And just to get a little bit into specifics, so the plant operates under what's called an NPDES permit, National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. And all treatment plants have such a permit, and they discharge, in a variety of ways. In our case, in Gloucester, the effluent gets discharged into the harbor. And my understanding is that the Gloucester treatment plant is one of the only, if not the only plant on the East Coast that still only uses primary treatment. Most plants have gone either to secondary or tertiary treatment. And so the folks that govern that permit, basically the federal EPA and the state DEP, have put it on extension. It has expired. And the question is going to be, how soon will they demand that the plant be upgraded? And there's been some preliminary discussions of that over the years, and they have made it clear that at some point the plant is going to need to be replaced. And that is a very, very significant financial challenge and logistical challenge, because the cost of either upgrading or replacing the plant has been estimated at least $60 million, and it's probably going to be more than that. That figure is from a few years ago. And so it's one of those things where it's a major capital improvement that has to be financed, at least in significant part, by a relatively small group of ratepayers and citizens and taxpayers. And so it's a major challenge. And this is true in many older cities where there's a lot of infrastructure that needs repair. And you throw something like this into the mix, and it becomes a really significant obstacle to have to overcome. Now, these projects do get assistance, and they get it from the state and the federal governments. So in the case of state government, we actually receive a lot of funding from the feds, and we use that for something called the SRF, the State Revolving Fund, which makes either 0 or 2% interest loans to the municipalities that are doing the projects. And if you take, for instance, a $60 million project that gets financed over a period of 10, 20, or 30 years, if you can get a loan at 0 interest, that adds up to a significant component of the project cost. And there are other ways that they can be assisted as well. But that is the nub of the problem, is that Gloucester continues to operate a primary treatment plant. There have been some modifications to make it more efficacious, but at the end of the day, it's still a primary treatment plant, and upgrades are going to need to happen. And exactly when they're going to need to happen is a function of the dictates of the federal EPA and the DEP. And I use the word dictates, but there also is a conversation that happens, and it has been happening between the municipality and those two agencies. And oftentimes what results is something that's called a consent decree, where the parties agree that they're going to abide by a particular schedule that's blessed by a court, but it's an agreed upon schedule and not something that's unilaterally required by one side or the other. But that's probably more information than I think you wanted, but that's roughly the situation.
Well, that's good to know. And I'm going to walk away believing that the next mayor of Gloucester this will be a serious issue for them to contend with. Is that right?
I agree. It's an issue that cannot be ignored. And it's one of those things where, the demand that the plant get upgraded may not happen tomorrow, but you can't wait until tomorrow to think about it. And that's something that obviously the legislative delegation, Representative Ferranti and me, will be interested in assisting the city and working with them. I know that Congressman Moulton has that interest, as do Senators Warren and Markey, as well as the Baker-Polito administration. So this is a large conversation, and it needs to be a large conversation. And it's something that shouldn't wait until the day we all wake up and hear, okay, you got to replace or upgrade the plant.
And again, just to clarify, there was recent work done to the plant that I believe $4.2 million the city paid to build the berm around it just because it was flooding, right?
So there's the berm, and I believe there was also some construction to put a roof or a containment building over some of the other apparatus that's there, to make it less odorous, at least to the outside world, and also to make it less susceptible to weather. So there have been things that have happened over the years at the plant. It hasn't been a situation where it was built and then left static. But again, the issue is, in terms of the main form of treatment, that's something that is going to require some change.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all this really great information. And I hope you can get on your boat this weekend.
Well, here's hoping to that. I'm hoping to get back to Gloucester at some point over the weekend from the State House. And, again, I always enjoy looking out the windows at your home and seeing what it's like on Cape Ann. And I hope you have a chance to not only get outside, but we've seen a very rambunctious dog in the background. And I hope that dog gets a chance to get out and enjoy the outdoors as well.
Yeah, we're doing this interview just late enough that my dog is saying, "What are you still doing in that chair? Get out of that chair, Mom." So anyway, that's what I'm going to do right now. But you have a good weekend and get some rest somehow. Okay, take care.
Thank you. You too. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks.
This episode of Cape Ann Today is brought to you by Bank Gloucester. Start here, get there.